Hey guys, before I start the video, this is Jake from the future. In this video, I say that you can often use a standard Pronto, or in Europe they were known as the 2000 or the 1500. I say that you can use a standard Pronto to fix the internals of the RF. This is only sometimes true. It's really only the very, very early Prontos that share the same kind of chassis design to the Rangefinder models. And I believe the way that you can tell is if it has the little battery cut out at the rear for factory testing purposes. If it's completely smooth in between the strap plugs, you cannot use it for spares. So I just thought I would digress. The other thing is that I really want to emphasize, I think I do go into it a little later in the video, these are very tricky to refurbish. I own one of these Rangefinder cameras personally, and I wanted to do the same upgrade that I did here in this video, and I've broken two of them attempting to do the capacitor mod. Taking the Rangefinder assembly off involves prying open the shutter so that you can release it. You guys will see that in a minute. Yeah, turns out that's really hard to do. Sometimes the plastic inside is insanely brittle and things snap. So no client cameras were hurt here. But yeah, please, 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 if you are going to attempt this at home, I'm gonna put up my card and say this is complex. Don't repair this at home, with the caveat being, unless you're very good at mechanical repairs or are happy to brick your camera. Because I've bricked two of them. Anyway, I thought about not releasing the video for this very reason, since it just seems that these are very difficult things to take apart, but I'm gonna leave the video in its entirety as I intended to publish it, so feel free to enjoy. Hello everyone, the Instant Camera Guy here. I have something from America, all the way from Baltimore, sent to me by a client of mine named Clint, and I'm going to unbox this because what should be contained in here is, I believe, one of the most underrated Polaroid cameras of all time. In fact, whenever I show one of these to people, a lot of people don't even know they exist. And so I'm always keen to talk about these things because I reckon they are really cool. So let's just continue the unboxing experience and I'll show you what we have. All right, there's a note in here. All right, it says, "Hi Jake, thanks for taking care of my Pronto RF. I'm excited to be able to use I-type film much easier for me to get than SX-70. Let me know if I have any questions. My email is and I can reach him on Instagram." Cool. Yeah, basically, what we have here is a Polaroid Pronto RF. Now, this is a box type camera, but it's a very special box type camera in that this camera has a built-in rangefinder. So if I swing my lamp over here to get a bit of a better look, you guys will see in the front housing there's a little cutout and there's a little window down here, and that actually lets light through into a little rangefinder assembly in the viewfinder here. And what that means is this is a camera that has a box type body, but a variable focus lens that you can actually focus. The standard Pronto camera is effectively the exact same, but it lacks the rangefinder. And so as far as I know, other than peel apart cameras, this is the only integral film rangefinder camera in existence, for whether it be for 600 or SX-70 film. Clint also has the accessory tripod socket that mounts to the bottom, which is really cool. And that basically makes this camera one of the most versatile box type cameras in existence. So to give you guys an example here, Whereas something like the standard one-step would have a single element meniscus lens, this has a triple element lens with variable focus, and of course it has the rangefinder. Focusing will go down to around 3 feet. And image sharpness wise, yes, it's only a plastic lens, but the thing that we need to consider here is that integral instant film doesn't exactly have a very high resolution to begin with. And honestly, sharpness between what this is capable of and the SLR SX-70 is really on par. Like, you'll get example photos from this and swear they were taken from the SLR version. It's really, really hard to tell which camera took what. But yeah, all of those features make this thing particularly versatile. The only disadvantage, of course, is being an SX-70 camera, you are rather limited by that slow 150, 160 ISO film. So that is why I'm going to do an I-type conversion on this. So my very first video on this channel, be it upside down because I didn't know that you guys preferred my hands to come from the bottom of the frame. My very first video was I-type converting a plastic white and rainbow one-step. So I'm going to do a bit of a video redemption and go a bit more in-depth on how to do a conversion on one of these, and I'll talk a little bit about calibrating the electric eye as well, because I didn't go into that in the last video. Now, I've already made myself up the little battery holder. I didn't want to have you guys sit through another one of those conversions since I've already done it twice on this channel now, so I've already done the soldering to that. Basically, it's going to be a matter of disassembling this camera, cleaning it all from the inside, and then basically making sure that everything works. And before I actually open anything up, I do want to test this thing. As far as I know, Clint says this camera works, so I just want to make sure it's survived the journey. I'm sure it has. Yep. As expected, it's functioning pretty darn well. Let's just test flash functionality. Yep. And as expected, it works completely fine. Honestly, these box type cameras are super reliable. Unlike the SX-70, the SLR cameras, which have heaps of design flaws and very complex design that ends up bricking them over time, these cameras' simplicity is the key to their survival. They do end up getting issues every now and again, particularly due to drop damage, but honestly, your odds of getting one of these completely untested and having it work, in inverted commas, is pretty darn good. So I enjoy working on these because they are usually quite well behaved. So what I'm going to do, before I tear this thing apart, I'm going to take this just into the next room where I have a nice view of the city on the horizon. I'm just going to make sure that the rangefinder is calibrated. Clint assures me that it is. I just want to make sure for myself just before I rip it apart, mainly because if it's not calibrated, I'm going to need to calibrate it, and that will slightly add to the expense. Not a lot, but it's just a bit of fiddling around trying to calibrate these things. I'll show you at least where the adjustment points are. I likely won't show any actual rangefinder calibration because it's a boring and tedious process requiring adjusting a screw and putting the cover back on and looking through the viewfinder and aligning infinity and repeating the process until it's perfect. So I'm going to hit pause for a second, then we're going to come back and dismantle this thing and I-type convert it, and then make it run off AAA batteries by installing the battery holder at the back. I'll be right back. Alright, I've just gone and tested the rangefinder and I can confirm it is 100% perfect. There is no need to touch it whatsoever. So we can launch straight into taking this thing apart. Now, being that this has a variable element lens cell, we will have a few extra steps when it comes to disassembling this camera. Around the side of the lens, you'll find little holes, and basically you need to poke some kind of a sharp spike into those holes to push back on a little plastic tab. And sometimes you need to just swivel the lens around to access the other hole. Like so, just gently does it. Put it back to infinity, and it comes off. Now, with this lens, Polaroid was nice enough to make everything built to high tolerances. So basically, you don't need to worry about muffing up the lens cell focus like you do on so many old 6x9 rangefinders. When it's at infinity, it's when the lens is screwed all the way in. So you don't need to worry about knocking anything out of calibration, which is really nice. Now, I'm going to put this little glass cell, the lens surrounding to the side. For anyone wondering at home, this is a 116mm f9.4. So really close in specs to the original SX-70 lens. It's just that this is triple element. The SX-70 lens is f8 and this is f9.4, but honestly really close in terms of design. Now, this camera, as I said, is in very clean condition. It's a little dusty, like under where the lens cell is. But really, that's it. That's about as much as we're going to need to worry. I'm obviously going to clean it inside and out when we refurbish this thing. I'm just going to squeeze and with a bit of pressure just press down on the clips that are on the inside. Sometimes, if they've never been opened, they're a little stiff. I think this is the first time this camera has been apart since like 1978 when it was built. And there we go. So very similar inside to a standard one-step. It's just that we have a few extra bits and pieces. So we've got that extra little window down the bottom, as you guys can see. So I'm going to grab a cloth. I'm going to grab my lens cleaner. And I'm just going to wipe down all the plastics of the dust. Might as well. While we've got the thing apart, it's going to be much easier to do so now than when it's back together. And yeah, fortunately this thing's very, very clean. I can't really see it having any issues on the inside. So fingers crossed, this is going to be a pretty straightforward refurbishment and restoration. Now, as far as I'm aware, the Pronto RF and the regular Pronto are exactly the same inside, with the exception of the rangefinder, which is a little add-on extra. And as far as I'm aware, hypothetically, let's say if this camera was broken and we needed a spare shutter, we wouldn't need to track down the rangefinder version. We could just use a standard Pronto to repair this, as far as I'm aware. Now, I'm just going to trim off the negative battery lead because it's huge for some reason. They never trimmed it down in the factory and I don't want it getting in the way of things. So let's continue to pull this thing apart. Again, sometimes these things can be a little stubborn if they've never come apart before. Holy moly, it's so tight in here. I remember having trouble with the one-step video that I showed as well. There's really only two settings for these. They either fly apart or you have to wrestle with them for a little bit. Let go! Yeah, these one-step cameras, there's literally only one of two speeds. They either completely fall apart, oh my goodness, or you have to really attack them in order to get the two halves apart. Oh my goodness, let go. All right, give me 2 seconds, just off camera. I'm gonna get my lamp and I'm just gonna, because I need to see exactly what I'm doing. It's simply just too difficult doing this on camera. Come on, let go. There we go. All I did was pulled a little bit harder. Oh my goodness. There we go. Oh, that's interesting. It's got some factory sticker here with a whole bunch of codes, OP, defect. I don't know what any of those things mean. I've never quite seen a sticker like this before inside one of these one-step cameras. So I'm sure this meant something to the factory, but it doesn't mean anything to me. One of the things that I'm going to do is remove these two little metal legs inside the camera. They don't do anything, except they will make inserting I-type film a bit more difficult. So they literally just pull out. We're going to throw those in the bin. They don't need to exist. I've seen on forums some people think that those legs like push up on the film pack. It's nothing like that. Anytime you see a metal tongue inside a Polaroid camera, its sole purpose is to prevent you from inserting what Polaroid would deem as like the wrong type of film. And it's really just to make consumers' life a little bit easier. But we obviously want to insert the wrong type of film, so it's going to be much better for us to just simply remove that tongue. And again, while the camera is apart, we're just giving everything a clean. This thing is super mint condition. I mean, it still has the original like factory tag on the strap, like not the tag, the little protective plastic bit. I'm not sure this camera's ever been used, really. I mean, you guys saw how hard it was to pull apart. I would hazard a guess and say this is practically new old stock. I'd be very surprised if anyone used this for more than a single pack of film. There's not a single shred of like developing chemical on the rollers at all. I'd be very surprised if this thing was ever used. Maybe it was a gift and people couldn't afford the film, who knows? Anyway, I've just cleaned up the little film counter window. Again, might as well while we're here. And really, I'm just going to take all the larger parts of the body of the camera and just put them over to the side, because we won't really need to touch any of those until it comes time to put this thing back together. So I'm going to take the little flash housing off as well. And now we can start to undo the guts of the camera. So the part that we need to replace is this little red capacitor, which is at the back of the rangefinder assembly. So hopefully I remember to edit into the video this time, but I will take a bit of B-roll. Last time I totally forgot. I was doing a video and I recorded a bunch of B-roll and just forgot everything. Forgot to include it. Luckily it wasn't very entertaining, but here we have what makes up part of the integration cycle. So we've got a resistor and then we've got a capacitor. Now in the standard one-step, Polaroid usually use a green colored capacitor, which is about 220 picofarads. This one is about 400 picofarads. I know just from experience. So usually when you see these red capacitors, they're 400. The original, or the ones that they usually use in one-steps are green and they are 200. And that means we are going to be replacing it with one a quarter the size. And that means we're replacing it with this little 100 picofarad capacitor. Now, what I didn't show in the one-step video is how to further calibrate this camera. So effectively, what we've got here, if we look at the shutter housing, we've got the electric eye, which is this bit here. Underneath this part sits this little toothed gear. And basically this gear moves a gradiated filter that sits behind the electric eye. And that gradiated filter, depending on its position, either lets in more or less light. Now, depending on how far you move it, that can be up to like 2 stops of difference in terms of light. So technically, to do a 600 mod on one of these, you could theoretically just slide that toothed cog all the way up, because basically the further upwards you slide this wheel, the darker the images get, and the further downwards you slide it, the lighter they get. But behind this electric eye, really in the mechanism where the shutter blades sit, is a little glass infrared filter. That is subject to the same amount of corrosion that SX-70s get. The main difference is it's really hard to access and clean. And so I would advise, do not bother. It's not worth it. Your likelihood of breaking the shutter and bricking the camera trying to access that window is too great. These shutter mechanisms, being that they are clipped together, really stripping the camera down any more than as you see here, has a very, very, very high risk of snapping plastic parts, and I do not recommend you do it. So, in my opinion, it is better to do the capacitor swap, as I'm about to show you, and
use this as compensation if we need to, rather than just simply rely on this. So back in the day when I used to do these, I wouldn't bother with a cap mod and I would just use this to compensate. And that would generally work pretty well for 600 film. I wouldn't recommend we do that. I would recommend we do the cap mod and then use this to give us some wiggle room at the end. So on that note, let's start to take off the rangefinder assembly, which is this bit on the side. So on the rangefinder assembly here, it basically clips into this little slot here. This little slot that it clips into you'll find on all other Pronto cameras. It's held in place by a spring, which basically pulls on the mechanism. So we've got to simply just disengage that spring first, just so that the camera will want to let go. We can leave that spring attached to this part down the bottom. And now we just have to remove it. Now, it is held in place by a little metal arm that inserts into the plastic. Now this little metal arm can be quite difficult to get the camera to let go. So what I like to do is just see if I can, and again I'm going to get the lamp here. I do apologize if you can't see exactly what I'm doing, but because of the rangefinder mechanism, these cameras just have that little bit of extra fiddliness. I'm going to try and just lift up on that and just lift the shutter housing slightly forwards. There we go. Now click it back down. Okay, great. And that's it. So that is the rangefinder housing, the rangefinder mechanism. And I make no exaggeration of this. There is not a single speck of dust. Like, okay, maybe there's 2 specks of dust in this entire thing. This camera was never used. I'm very confident. It is just too clean. In the rangefinder mechanism itself, I'm going to hold it in my hand here so the camera focuses a little bit. We have a little brass adjustment screw, and there should be another brass adjustment screw. Yeah, here at the top. So we've got one down the bottom, one at the top here. One of those will be for horizontal adjustment, one will be for vertical adjustment. This one's perfect, and those screws are held in place with Loctite, so I'm not going to need to change them. I will literally just sit this over to the side because nothing needs to be adjusted on that. It's going to be fine to leave it as is. Now we've got to take the housing off the little electric eye assembly. I want to reiterate at this point, by the way, let me get my famous little card here. This is a pretty complex repair. It's pretty fiddly. I'm making this look easy, and certainly this is easier than refurbishing an SLR SX-70. But like I said, really taking off that rangefinder mechanism and having to separate the shutter like that, if you slip, you can separate a bunch of the clips and then the blades will fall out. It's bad news. You don't want to do that. And there's always a risk that even I could do that while taking apart one of these cameras. Fortunately, being that we can use a standard Pronto to fix these, it's not that big a deal because spare parts for these are fortunately very cheap. But I would rather not break the client's camera, if you know what I mean. So I'm just lifting off the little protective bit that sits over the electric eye at the back of the photo cell here. It's kind of clipped in place and it's a little annoying to remove. It's just a little black housing. I'll put that over to the side. And now we have great access to the capacitors at the back. So for this, I'm actually going to turn on my desoldering gun now that it actually works. I realized that I should have done this while I was doing everything else. But yeah, I've basically just unclipped the eye, we've peeled back the ribbon cable, and we're getting ready to desolder the capacitor from this. I have a 100 picofarad capacitor ready to be installed. Someone asked me the other day, like, what exact specs of capacitor you should use because they were a bit confused about the voltage. As a general rule of thumb, in any kind of electric circuit, a capacitor will have 2 values. One will be the farads, picofarads, nanofarads, whatever it is. That value stands for the amount of electrical charge a capacitor can hold. The voltage of a capacitor is to do with the maximum voltage that the capacitor can handle. And really, when you're designing an electronic circuit, you want the capacitor to be able to withstand a higher voltage than the voltage that's normally going to be flowing through the camera. So a Polaroid camera is only ever going to be powered by 6 volts. Like if you're powering a Polaroid camera off more than 6 volts, something's gone horribly wrong. Like you're going out of your way to do that. So 6 volts is all that you need to power these things. So these little ceramic capacitors really just have to be able to withstand over 6 volts. So the ones that I'm using are rated to 50 volts, which is more than enough. There is no time that these are ever going to blow. You can get capacitors that go up to like handling 2000 volts. They're a lot bigger, so they're a larger size. So really you just need like 50 volts is fine. That's what these caps are rated for. And like I said, if you're somehow getting 50 volts traveling through this circuit, you got bigger problems. But I've just bent the legs on this little guy to make it easier to install, because the leads on the original capacitors here are radial. And these are radial, but they kind of stick down, so I have to bend them to the side a little bit, but that's fine. So I'm just going to grab a little drink of water, and soldering iron is nearly hot. Oh yeah. Thirsty work fixing cameras. Now in my first video I tried to use this desoldering gun, and it just straight up didn't work. Turns out it was because the filter had become clogged. I've since cleaned that, and I should have a functioning gun now. There we go. And this just sucks the solder away from the old leads. Much easier than using wick. And of course it's sort of non-consumable, other than the filters, of course. So we should, yeah, there you go. The capacitor is already like falling out. It's just a little blob of the solder at the end. There we go, preventing it from coming out. And that is the part that we have. Now, just for the sake of my sanity, I will be getting my little capacitor reading machine, which, by the way, I've converted. Like this goes into a buck converter, which comes out of USB, so I can actually power this thing off a pack of film, which is really cool. But basically, I've got these little test leads, and these leads just hook up to either side of the capacitor, and it should just be a matter of me hitting that button, and it'll tell me what value this is. It should be about 400 picofarads. 465. Absolutely fine. So 465. The general rule of thumb, like the guides will say to put a capacitor in that is 4 times smaller. I actually find, factoring in the age of the eye, dividing the number by 5 generally gets you closer to the perfect exposure. So that's exactly what I've done. So 100 should be a perfect capacitor size for this camera. Now, how do I know that? Well, I know that from direct experience. Years ago, I got so cheesed off with the inaccurate information that was out there about capacitor modding that I literally spent like an entire year researching and trialing different capacitors and formulas and that kind of stuff on getting the 600 mods correct. And then when I was happy with my research, I wrote a huge in-depth article, which Joaquin de Prada was gracious enough to post on his website. The Open SX-70 blog. So if you guys ever want the most long-winded but informative article on 600 conversions, I highly suggest you guys check it out. It took me so long to write. It's like a novel, but it is far and away the most in-depth resource in terms of 600 modding these cameras that you can ever hope to find. So that capacitor is done. Now I'll add, there's no point in film testing this thing at the moment, because with that little electric eye cover off, if too much light gets into that sensor, the shutter will actually fire so fast that the shutter doesn't open. And so you'll think that the camera is broken. So it's tempting to hook this up to some power and try test it, but don't bother, there's no point. I've done that before and like had a heart attack because I thought that I broke the camera. It was fine. It was fine the whole time. And so that's really the hard part done. So the capacitor's just got to sit to the side. We do need to put that little rangefinder arm back in and then hook up the spring. And then the body of the camera is going to be pretty much fine. We can work on the, chassis of the camera will be fine. Then we can work on the body. Which, again, if I haven't made this clear enough already, holy moly, it's so clean. This is the cleanest Pronto RF I've ever seen, hands down. Clint, you are going to be so stoked with this thing. Because I certainly am. All right, so we've got the little arm that connects to the rangefinder. That's got to go over that green ring. And that bit has to clip in. That leg has to go down the bottom. And so now it's just a matter of fiddling around with everything, moving that forwards, and it's going to go in a lot easier than it comes out. There we go, it's already in. Make sure that moves. Beautiful. And we'll hook that spring back on. Get in there. Springs are so much harder to put back on than they are to take off. There we go. All right. So we'll just angle the capacitor here so it's not touching anything. There we go. Brilliant. And that is it, really. That should be the body of this thing pretty much done. Now, what we have to do now is obviously wire in the new battery pack. Polaroid crimps in the terminals for these RF cameras, so I will actually just have to cut that. There's no way that I'm going to be able to undo that black wire without breaking it. So we just cut it, strip it, and now we can start to wire in the new one. So I will be installing the battery back now. Now, as I said in the one-step video, it is very tempting to directly mount this back in the center, right? So that it's aesthetically pleasing, but I like to mount it a few millimeters off to the side. Why? Because some accessory flashes for the SX-70 clip over the eyepiece here. And if you mount it directly in the center, they will not clip. So it is best to offset it. On the off chance that Clint wants to use like an ITT Magic Flash or something like that, modified for 600, because you could just tint it with some filter material. So I'll be mounting it so that Clint can use the vast majority of Polaroid accessories that are out there. So, should just be a matter of taking off my double-sided tape. I'm using the same tape as I always do. It is automotive grade. It is super invincible. I'm just going to prep the surface with a bit of alcohol, but I'm really just doing this for thoroughness. It's so clean. It's really so clean that there's no imperfections here for anything to really get in the way. So we'll take off the double-sided tape. And once we've stuck it down, we'll drill the hole, send the wires through inside, and then I'll solder everything together. And I'll talk a bit about how I've wired everything as I do that, because I had a few questions on it asked. Now, I'm just going to take this off camera while I center the, while I put on the battery holder. All right. So I'm just going to take this off camera while I hold it in between my legs, just to put it on. Because you only get one shot at this, really. And there we go. So, mounted slightly off center. Make sure that the back of that is square. And that is looking really good. Great. All right. Now, I just got to drill through the hole that I've already drilled. And that is basically the only real modification that needs to happen to the body of the camera. Sadly, it does need that hole drilled into it. Now, on the Pronto RF, Polaroid does technically have these 2 test holes. So if we wanted external cabling, technically you could put them through there, but that just looks bad. It's much better to do it through here. But that was only really found on the RF and some very early variants of the SX-70. And either way, they're a really tight fit for those wires, so we probably have to enlarge some of the holes anyway. Right, so with that hole in place, we can now mount some of the wires. And this keeps everything internal. It keeps any wires from becoming exposed to the outside world, so it's certainly the safest way to mount these things. Because there are going to be nothing exposed outside of the battery box. Nothing that can get pulled on or yanked. So we'll send these wires through. There we go, send the black one through. And then I've put a green wire in here as well. So black wire goes straight to the black cable inside the camera. This green wire will go to the negative battery terminal inside the camera. Now, the way that this is going to be wired up is so that with the switch to the left, you're going to be powering the camera directly off AAAs. If I flick that switch to the right, power is going to go from the internal battery terminal up into the switch and then straight back into the camera. And what that's going to do is allow you to power the camera off of AAA batteries or 600 film. And so what that should mean is you've always got a backup to power the camera in case your AAAs run out or something like that. You've really got 2 options, which I think is really convenient. Last thing that I need to insert here is the positive battery terminal, which I took off the camera before. So I just have to put it back in. Again, poke the wire through, get all 3 wires going to where they need to be. And now we are ready to do some soldering. And really putting everything together is sort of the hardest part about doing this mod. I'm going to just strip back a little bit of the black wire here. And we're going to bring back the chassis of the camera. I have already cut myself a bit of heat shrink, so I'm very much prepared. I was much more prepared this time around than doing my first video, but that makes sense. I've learned a lot in the 3 weeks or so that this channel's been running. And the cool thing about this modification, as you guys can see, it's not requiring a ton of complex parts. This is relatively inexpensive for me to do, and it makes the camera so much more usable. I mean, having 640 ISO film in this little camera, you guys could see from the lens here, this is an f9.4. It is so close to being SX-70 spec. Performance is going to be up there with like what the 680 is capable of in terms of lighting scenarios. So this is a really usable little camera once this conversion has been done. So we've put black to black. I'm going to solder the green directly to the negative terminal here. So I'm going to put a bit of solder on that first. I've already tinned the green wire off camera. There we go. I'm going to do exactly the same to the positive wire. Obviously the positive wire has 2 red wires going to it. One that was there from the factory, and then obviously one that's going to be running from the battery compartment. Spin that around. I'll actually just tin the red wire here as well. Melt the solder. And that's it. Wait for that solder to set, because these battery terminals have quite the mass in terms of being able to retain heat. And that basically does it. Now it's just simply a matter of putting it all back together. Now, this little black ring, by the way, is a little washer. It always falls off. It goes just over the electric eye. It literally does nothing. Like Polaroid included these on early model 1-steps, and then they just straight up deleted them from later models. I really don't know what this silly thing is supposed to do. I'll put it back, but it doesn't matter. Like, you can reassemble the cameras with it, without it. As I said, Polaroid literally deleted it from the lineup. If you get later model 1-step cameras, it doesn't even exist. But it seems that these RF cameras were made in earlier batches. I'm not sure for how long they made them, but they certainly are not as popular as the cheap white and rainbow ones. All right, what am I doing here? I've got to put the side lead back on. It feels like I'm forgetting something, but I'm not. I mean, the rangefinder assembly doesn't even need cleaning. Honestly, it's so spotless. I think I would be adding dust if I put a cloth on it. I do need to put this bit back. This is the little flash clip housing, so that just goes at the top. And obviously we need to put the front door on. The world's most spotless front door. We just need to make sure that all the wires are sitting in nicely, but that's all going in. I think it's going to be a little stiff clipping this back together, just because this body has, I'm guessing, really just never come apart. And once this goes back together, that should pretty much be it. It's just going to be a bit of a challenge putting it back together. It will go. There we go. Ta-da! Cool. All right, where's my pack of film gone? Now, when I insert this, it's probably going to do nothing. Oh, no. Oh, yeah, because I've got it switched to the right. Now it should do nothing. Great. All right, well, I'm going to box this up and film test it and come back a little later with some nice results, hopefully. Oh, just quickly, while I film test this, obviously I'll be checking the exposure and I'll be seeing whether or not this little light dark wheel needs sliding up or down. Because I'm at a new property, being in West Australia, I used to live in Melbourne, obviously. I had a certain spot that I would use to test exposures, which I knew exactly what the exposure was supposed to look like. I used to test cameras early in the morning because that's when light was best at my old house. In my new property, I found it's best to test the cameras in the afternoon because the sun is setting and I get a beautifully lit city skyline with all of the light shining in one direction. So it's a very flat, uniform surface to take photos of, and it looks a lot nicer. So I will be film testing this and coming back a little later in the afternoon. I won't be doing it right now. So if you guys see like the lighting conditions have changed outside, that would be why. But it does seem that it's going to work properly. While I had the little electric eye cover off, I could actually see that blue infrared filter, and it really doesn't look like there's any corrosion on it whatsoever. So I'm guessing that the capacitor that I put in there should require basically no adjustment of that toothed wheel. I'm pretty confident. Maybe 1 or 2 teeth is all I'm going to need to adjust this thing, but I think it's going to be in pretty good nick. So I'll be back later this afternoon and we'll see what it looks like. All right, we have one finished Pronto RF with running off batteries at the moment. I just have a regular pack of film, but it is currently running off battery mode. And it works really nicely. I had to do a little bit of dicking around to the motor inside because some of the bearings had dried out, so they needed a bit of contact cleaner and a little bit of oil in order to stop the motor from randomly screaming every now and again. But in the end, we got there after swapping a few parts and things like that. And I am happy to report that we do have beautiful sample photos. Ignore the small light leaks here. This happened because I was salvaging film from one pack of film to from one camera to another. So pretend like that bit doesn't exist. But here we have a morning sun exposure, I believe. Sorry, afternoon sun exposure. We have morning sun exposure. We have, of course, indoors without a flash. Good luck trying that on a camera that takes SX-70 film. You'll end up with a blurry mess. And I think this photo in particular, like this came out really gorgeous. The colors on this are just utterly awesome. And it really highlights just how capable these cameras can be once they're modified to take a superior format of film. So this was taken at about a distance of 1 meter away. And of course I have one obligatory mirror selfie as well. Now, each of these absolutely nailed it out of the park in terms of exposure. It is absolutely spot on. There was no compensation required. These were all taken on the middle setting. And I am absolutely chuffed to be able to send this camera back to Baltimore to its owner. And that's really all I wanted to say in this video. You guys have seen me upgrade one of what I think is one of the most underrated Polaroid cameras ever produced. And yeah, now takes AAA batteries and I-type film, as well as 600 at the flick of a switch. And I just think it's really neat. Anyway, thank you for watching. As always, should you want me to refurbish one of your cameras, please feel free to drop me a line using any of the links below. If you love what it is that I do, please feel free to make a donation on my Ko-fi account, suggest future content, or even just give a like and a subscribe. Until then, you've been a wonderful audience, happy shooting, and I'll see you in the next video.